Seven place. Finally, the last one. Starting in 2 weeks. We'll see in 3 weeks.
Eureka family process comes out. Babies, he's a kid.
Right out the door. It will be my
It's not a big door, it's urgent care. I don't like that. Get in, get out. Don't even talk to you.
Oh.
That's why I moved my stuff over.
So are we rolling? We got sound? Testing, testing. Can you hear me? There it is. Oh, now it's working. Yeah, we don't need it that loud. Did anyone notice a difference? I didn't hear much of an echo when I watched the thing a couple days ago. Was it better? Okay, good. I've been bending the mic a little closer. Okay. Hey, Marcos, would you open us with prayer this morning?
Sure.
Thanks.
Father in heaven, I pray for this service that you would help us to put attention to your word, and that you would show us yourself through your word, and give us minds to focus and to understand today's lesson and to apply it to our lives. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. So what, we got a question?
Turn your other mic.
They're supposed to both be on. This one's on. This one has a light on. Does that mean it's on?
Yeah.
Maybe I should pull it up further. Testing. Is that better? I can put it up closer. I just put new batteries in.
Yeah, well, I'm not hearing you on mine.
Well, maybe I should turn it off and back on again. Let's try that. It shows full battery. Okay, now it's off. And now it's on. Testing. Okay, he's got it. Maybe your phone is slow. Okay, now we got it. Good. Yeah, I guess it's about 20 seconds behind being live. Well, I guess if I make a slip up, I can. No, it won't work.
Back it up.
Wasn't that the whole plot of the? There was a Robert Redford movie with a scam where they delayed the sound, the sting, yeah. Okay, well, this is our 9th week in the Old Testament book of Job. Job was a rich and godly man back in the time of Abraham, but he came under surprise attack from the Satan. And in front of all the angels, Lucifer said that if God allowed Job's life and health to be smashed, Job would curse God to his face. But Job knew none of this heavenly debate, and thus one day he lost all of his wealth and his children to human and supernatural disasters. And about a month later, we're guessing, he was struck with black leprosy. Now the devil chose this kind of a disease not only because it's painful and ugly, but because it would destroy all of Job's social relationships and friendships. Because a leper is cast out of society, his wife didn't even want Job living home anymore because he stank and was horribly sick, and maybe he was even contagious. So he had to live alone at the garbage dump. It's sometimes called an ash heap. That's because at the local garbage dump they would periodically burn all the stuff to keep some of the flies away. So he was not only homeless, he was diseased and incurably homeless. Job still had one family member left, that's his wife, and unfortunately Satan used her too. She yelled at him for remaining loyal to God and said he should just get it over with and curse God and die. Well, that's exactly what Lucifer wanted, because he didn't have permission to kill Job, so if Job offed himself, it'd be perfect for him. But Job refused and said she was speaking like a foolish woman. Now last week we looked at the three friends who came to comfort Job. They arrived in chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. They were named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And usually they put them in the order of either their age or their importance. So we would guess then that Eliphaz was either the oldest or the smartest or the richest, or in some way he was Job's best friend. And they heard about Job's disasters, at least the first day disasters, and they gathered together to come visit Job and comfort and console him. Now I believe that they had not yet heard about his leprosy. But we did discuss why did they come all together. I suspect that it's because they were nervous about visiting Job after all those raiders attacking him. You know, you don't want to go into a war zone alone. So I think they came in a big group with probably bodyguards and soldiers. I don't think they knew of Job's sickness because they were so shocked when they arrived, and it said they didn't even recognize him. It's most likely that they went to his house first looking for him, and he wasn't there. Maybe his wife said, go look at the garbage dump. And so they went to the dump, and there he was sitting in the ashes. And they were shocked. So I don't think they knew about that. They see Job, he's all covered in red, leaky boils, and he's got black, scabby skin and fat feet and fat hands all swollen up, and he's sunburned probably. It says they didn't even recognize him. They lamented aloud, they sat on the ground, and they threw dust in the air over their heads. We believe that that's a way of saying, as Jesus said in Genesis chapter 3, that you're just dust, and you're going to return to dust. So this is a way of showing they recognize their own mortality now that they see Job, because he's on the verge of death. But then they sat there and they didn't speak to Job for 7 whole days. Now these men were good friends to Job. Their intention was to mourn with him and comfort him. No one else has even tried this, not even his own wife. At least we don't know of anything like that. And the Hebrew word for mourn is a very intimate word. It's like rocking a body back and forth, like hugging a weeping baby and rocking them. So they came and they wanted to help, but when they arrived, they did not or could not comfort Job. Why? Well, one thing is Job has leprosy, so you're not going to hug him, and you're not going to rock him like a baby because you might get the leprosy, so they're not going to touch him. So they sit at a distance, and they grieve out loud, and they weep, and they are terrified. Now, why are they terrified? Well, rich folks can live a really sheltered existence. I don't know if you've ever met any rich folks, but rich folks, they don't have a lot of needs, per se, because they have enough money to cover all their needs. At least they think they do. And so, just like many of us Americans, we've probably had very little personal experience with suffering. Rich people don't suffer much. They don't get hungry. They don't get cold. They don't lack for any clothing or cars or anything, so they don't suffer. And that means they can't empathize with other people. I just read that last night, emphasize. Somebody said, one of my friends on Facebook, when his wife said she was depressed, he said, I empathize with you. And everyone laughed and said, you mean empathize? He said, oh yeah. So here, I just pulled the same one. Empathize. You can't empathize with people who suffer if you've never suffered. And this is one reason I suspect that I knew I wasn't ready when I left seminary to become a pastor, because I had never really faced any suffering. And I kept running into people in churches who had been suffering and thinking, I can't help them. I don't know what they're going through. So a lot of young guys come out of seminary and they don't know how to empathize yet. So I think that was the case with Job's 3 friends. The other thing is they felt helpless to do anything. You know, rich guys like to fix problems. A lot of men just naturally want to fix things. It's just normal for us to want to fix things. Rich guys even more so, because not only do they like fixing things, they can afford to fix things. So the first thing they want to do, I suspect, my guess is that they brought along with their bodyguards 100 camels and 100 sheep and 100 oxen to give to their friend Job so he could get his business going again. You know, that would solve his problems and he'd be happy again. At least he could get his work going again. And then they show up and he's got leprosy, and all those camels and sheep and oxen aren't going to do him any good because no one will buy them or rent them from a leper guy. So their plans to fix or help him are gone. And that would make them really feel helpless. Now, they planned to speak with Job to console him, but they didn't. They cried and they threw ashes on themselves. But they didn't speak a word for 7 whole days. Why didn't they speak? Some people say that they were just being respectful of Job's grief, They saw how bad it was for him, and so they didn't want to interrupt his grief. But a week of silence, I don't buy that as being a good thing. I mean, I realize a lot of people say that's the best thing they did, because the rest of the time they're attacking him. So in comparison to, shall we attack him or shall we be quiet? Being quiet is better, but it's not good. It's not helping Job at all. It's just making things worse. Yeah,
But you don't always know what to say to someone when you see them suffering or going through something.
that is true.
You know, because people don't always stop and think before they open their mouths to say, you know, something. And it's like, I mean, that could have been part of it too. They want to help them, but they don't know,
They want to help, but they don't know what to say.
Words.
And that's true. We often don't know what to say. But we should say something. I mean, hello?
Yes.
I hope you feel better. You know,
Yeah.
you could say something after a week.
I guess I meant consoling words. I mean, not just in
Right.
normal greetings.
It is true that if you don't know what to say, it's better to be quiet. But why stay there a week and not say anything?
I was actually gonna say that it kind of lets you know that perhaps maybe they're not as good of friends
Yes.
as they are supposed to be portrayed as, because it sets you up for the rest of the story where they're truly not the best of friends to say the things that they say.
Yeah, it's true that they don't appear after this to be that great of friends. Was their friendship entirely based on his riches? I mean, he's the richest guy in the East, so it's good to be friends with the richest guy in the East, isn't it? So that's a possibility too. But the one thing I told you, there was a tradition in ancient Judaism, when you showed up to grieve for someone who had just died, you would be quiet for a week. And so the implication could have felt to Job like they've already decided I'm dead. They're not going to talk to me because I'm already dead. And that wouldn't be real cheering to the guy sensing it. You know, I'm a dead man already. Thanks a lot, guys. Yes,
Culturally, with the leprosy, he pretty much was dead. You know?
that's true. He was dead to them in a sense because he could never again touch them, work with them, couldn't do anything with them. So that's true. In a sense, he was dead. But that doesn't cheer him up at all. Okay, so they planned to console him emotionally, but they didn't. My opinion is that they were terrified of Job's condition because they had to face the fact that one day they could be like Job. And that's not something you want to think or feel. That is what you call insecurity. And rich people don't like to be insecure. Nobody likes to be insecure, but especially rich people because it's something they rarely get. Now, Job was the richest top boss in the region. And Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were somewhere under Job's level, but still rich and powerful guys in their own right. If they harbor the thought for even one moment that God might do this to them, like he did it to Job, that would cause you a lot of terror. It's just like the feeling you have when you're afraid you're going to hell. If you have a disturbed conscience and you're not a believer, the thought of going to hell is pretty nasty. Well, that's basically what these guys are thinking. If God would do this to Job, they might do it to me. They can't face that. So for days they sit there and they're trying to think to themselves, how do I get around this pain? And the only way they could think about it was Job must have sinned. And since we haven't sinned, God won't do this to us. So the only reason God did it to them is because he was a wicked sinner. We didn't know it. He hid it really well. But that's probably what they're thinking at this point. It's what you call a coping mechanism in psychology. Teenagers, no offense intended, but teenagers are too stupid to know that life is dangerous and that they're in danger. And so teenagers often go speeding in their cars and doing drugs and making moronic dares. I guess the latest dare is bashing your heads against each other to see if you can get a concussion. That's a wonderful, stupid thing. But what was the last one?
Tide Pods, that's.
Tide Pods, eating Tide Pods.
Yeah.
Yeah, stupid things teenagers do because they don't realize that they're stupid.
I wonder if it's that they don't realize or if they just feel that they're immune to any of the dangers, like that it's not gonna happen to them.
Yes, there's a feeling of invincibility when
Right,
you're young.
that's what I'm thinking.
So anyway, that's what we call denial. If you face a serious fear, though, in your older years, denial is the most common way of pushing away that fear. So these three friends cannot face the fear of pain, losing their wealth, losing their families, and losing their bodily functions. So it's easier to decide that Job deserved it. And since I don't deserve it, it won't happen to me. That's a coping mechanism. Now maybe Job was happy to see them when they arrived. Might have given them given him a little hope. Oh, here's my friends. They're going to help me and talk to me and make me feel better. But after a week, when they were quiet and they stayed at a distance and didn't speak to him, maybe he started worrying. At first he might have said, oh, they're just worried about catching my disease, so they're going to keep their distance. But when the 5th and 6th days go by, what is Job supposed to think when they don't speak to him? Why are they here? Why are they silent? Well, Job already started to guess in his heart what they were thinking. My friends have already decided that this is my fault. God has turned against me because I'm wicked. So he already suspects that that's what they believe, and in fact, he was right. So then after that, we talked about how God wants us to help suffering people as a church. Now, this is one of the missions of the Church of Jesus around the world. It's the nature of the church, and we'll talk about this more next week especially. But Philip Yancey wrote a book about suffering and pain, and here's what he said. Jesus' decision to operate as the invisible head of a large body with many members, that's the church, affects our view of suffering. It means that he often relies on the church to help one another cope. So one mission of the church, people, friends here, is that you can help each other and comfort each other. That's part of our mission. We are the body of Christ. The kingdom of Jesus is the church. And Jesus continues his ministry of healing and helping people on the earth through us. It is true, he can use angels, he can use the Holy Spirit, he can intervene directly with miracles. But most of the time he doesn't do that. Most of the time he sends people like us. Now that can be good and scary. Sometimes we can mess things up, but hopefully we can help. Now there are a lot of people right here in Eureka, we discussed a little bit, who have spiritual needs and emotional needs that we can meet. You don't have to fly to Africa to help people. There's people here. In Humboldt County, this is just about as pagan a place as you can find in the United States. As I told you last week, the surveys show that 78% of our residents have no religion at all. And only 14% go to churches that might be Christian. So you're probably looking at somewhere around 90% of the people in our county not being Christians. So our mission field here is vast. You don't have to go around the world to find it. So now we'll move on to chapter 3 of Job. Go ahead and turn to chapter 3. It's where we'll be the rest of the morning. Chapters 1 and 2 were the introduction. They were done in a narrative style. A narrative style is usually third person with sort of the God view, they call it in writing. God is watching and telling you all the details that you wouldn't know on your own. But now we're going to switch to poetry. This is the poetic section. This is the long debate between Job and his friends. Poetry is harder to understand, not just because it's poetry. By nature, though, poetry is more emotional and subjective and flowery in language. But in this case, this is ancient Hebrew poetry, which means it's even harder than normal poetry. In fact, I explained to you the first couple of weeks that the poetry in Job, a lot of words in this book are not seen anywhere else in the Bible. They occur one time. It's called the hapax legomena, which means nobody knows what it means. You might be able to guess based on the three-letter root that it's similar to this word and that word. So you can guess what it might mean. But the truth is you don't know what it means. And so it's quite possible that we won't understand half of the poetry that's here because we don't even know what the words mean. But hopefully we can find enough understanding that the Holy Spirit will enlighten us, that we'll understand at least some of it and get the purpose of the Scripture, which is to help us live better lives and become closer to God. So we'll give us our best shot here. So after sitting there for a whole week with his friends not helping him, Job bursts, sort of like a dam bursts. And it's a lot like David wrote in Psalm 39, 2 and 3. Let me read to you what David wrote in that chapter. I was mute with silence. I held my peace even from good, and my sorrow was stirred up. My heart became hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Now, most of the time, we think of bursting after we're angry. You know, you have a slow burn. You get more and more angry, and finally you get so angry that you just have to pop. Well, in this case, this is an explosion of grief. This is what happened to Job here, I think. After months of self-control, he had a glimmer of hope when his friends showed up that maybe things will get better now. But instead of getting better, they get worse. And so all of his hope vanishes, and he bursts. Now, the clearest outline of this chapter that I've seen so far divides the chapter into two pieces. Verses 1 through 13 the first half are Job's curse on the day of his birth. And then the last part of the chapter, verses 14 to 26, are Job's lament about his life. So first is the curse, and then is the lament. And one reason to believe that, that's the reason I went with this idea, is because verses 13 and 26 both say almost the same thing. They both say that I wish I had rest. So in verse 13, Job says, I wish I had rest. And in verse 26, I wish I had rest. So that appears to be the theme of both little sections of Job chapter 3. So let's just read. I'm going to read to you verses 1 through 13. This is from the New King James Version of Job chapter 3. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. By the way, this is another narrative sentence. It just summarizes what he's about to do. And Job spoke and said, May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle over it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. Oh, may that night be barren. May no joyful shouts come into it. May those who curse it curse the day. Those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. May the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light and have none, and not see the dawn of the day. Because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me, or why did the breasts let me nurse? For now I could have lain still and been quiet. I could have slept, and I would have rest. Okay, so this is the first part of Job's curse. First of all, you notice that Job cursed the day of his birth. Verse 1 summarizes what he's about to say. Now, he does not curse God directly. And you remember, that's what the devil wanted. The devil promised that Job would curse God to his face. But that's not exactly what Job does. What does he do? He curses the light. He curses the darkness. He curses calendars. He curses time. He curses existence. And he curses everything except God. Okay? It's almost like a game. He's tap dancing around it. He doesn't want to curse God, so he just curses everything about God. Okay? Now, that's not right, you realize. This is a little bit of a tantrum. If you tell little George or Johnny to stop doing something, he might not get angry to your face, but he might jump up and down and stamp his feet and scream and carry on. Because he knows that if he rebels directly to your face, he'll get whomped or spanked. So he just dances all around it, hoping to get away with it. That's what Job seems to be doing here. He's angry at God, but he doesn't dare to say so. This reminds me a lot of a popular country music song that I always thought was catchy, but it disturbed me a little bit, by Carrie Underwood. It's called Before He Cheats. Apparently, in this video, in this song, she thinks her boyfriend's cheating with somebody at a bar. So she goes out to his car and keys it and breaks the headlights and breaks the windshield and stabs the tire, so she wrecks his car. She's mad at him, but she doesn't challenge him. She just takes it out on his car. Now that's what you call passive-aggressive. That's what Job is doing here. Job won't curse God, but he'll curse everything that God does. Now, why would you do that? Well, I suspect that all of us do that at one time or another. How often have you prayed honestly that you were angry with God? Have you ever even done it? David did it, and Job did it, and Jeremiah did it. A lot of people in the Bible did it, and we don't do it. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, most Americans, especially Christians, we seem to think that anger is evil. Now, anger isn't evil. You realize Jesus got angry sometimes, and it wasn't a sin. So it's not anger itself that's evil. Now, it is true that Job is improperly angry. Now, when you think about the old saying, when people are having an argument or are really angry at each other, usually someone wise will say, well, it takes two to tango. Okay? If it takes two to tango, that means both you and God are tangoing. But guess who's wrong? You. 100% of the time, he's right and you're wrong. But it doesn't mean that God doesn't allow you to be angry. In fact, wouldn't it be better to admit that you were angry, because that's really what you feel? Whether it's right or not doesn't mean you don't feel it. And so it's better to express your anger to God and be honest with him, than it is to pretend you're not angry and during your prayers curse about everything that's going on. At least that's my suspicion. And it's interesting to me that God, at the end of the book, doesn't challenge Job for this particular thing. He does say, who is this who minces words without knowledge? So he basically says, you're ignorant, Job, you don't understand. But he doesn't say you were evil. God seems to be a lot more tolerant of our anger than humans are. The humans, his friends, are going to get really angry now and try to defend God. But God doesn't seem to mind that much. You know why? One reason is God became human. Jesus was here. God knows what it's like to be a human. And he knows that we're just dust and that we're going to mess things up. And he is more forgiving of our weaknesses than people usually are. So anyway, I think Job is messing up here. Certainly, he is challenging the sovereignty of God. And in fact, he's doing it worse than you might think. Don't think too badly of Job, though. First of all, consider yourself. How many of you would have cracked long before this? You would have cracked on day one after you lost your jobs. You really would have cracked when your kids died. Now he's facing even more trials. Now he's sick and all his friends are gone. And he's doomed to live a life at the dump. So that's one reason not to think too badly of Job. But here's another reason. Job, consider the difference between you and Job. We have it far better than Job. And I don't mean just because we haven't suffered like he did. I mean because of the Bible. Job was the first book of the Bible written, which means what? He had nothing to turn to written down. All he had, Job and Abraham and all these other guys, until Moses wrote parts of the Bible, the Torah, and Job perhaps, until then, they had no Bible. All they had was oral traditions, things that their dad told them, and their granddad said, and their great-granddad said about Adam and Eve and the flood. So everything came through Adam and Seth and Noah. That's all he's got. And so far, there is nothing sure to hang on to except what he heard. He has no proof of the goodness of God, or particularly in this case, of the idea of the intermediate state, the afterlife. What's going to happen to me when I die? They have only vague ideas of what's going to happen, because God hasn't told them. So don't think of him too badly. Here's what Barnes wrote. Job had far less light than we have. He could not be sustained by the hopes and promises that the Christian now possesses. And that's true. We've got it way better than Job, because we've got the Bible to give us promises from God. In other words, no Bible books were written yet. So his confusion and his frustration are understandable because the world is not yet blessed with the Word of God. He has no scripture to back him up. But let me tell you about another lament in the Bible. In fact, this one is almost exactly like Job's, and it's in the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 14 through 18. It's interesting that one of his nicknames, Jeremiah, is often called the depressed prophet, because he was pretty depressed. But here's what he said in chapter 20, verses 14 through 18. Cursed be the day in which I was born. Let the day not be blessed when my mother bore me. Let the man be cursed who brought news to my father, saying, you have a male child born. Let him hear the cries in the morning and the shouting at noon, because he did not kill me in the womb. Oh, that my mother had been my grave, and her womb always enlarged with me. Why did I have to come out of the womb to see labor and sorrow? Oh, that my days would be consumed with shame. So Jeremiah says basically the same thing that Job said. In fact, it almost looks like he was quoting from Job. Now, I do have to try to explain something really complicated here, but it's amazing and it's worth the time. And I'm still struggling with it because I only learned it 2 days ago. So this is new to me. I haven't had time to digest it yet. I sensed that there was a pattern in the first 13 verses, but I couldn't place it. But I found a commentator named John Hartley who explained very well what I believe I was seeing there. You see, in ancient times, a lot of people believed in magic. Perhaps because demons had taught those kinds of things. If you remember, shortly after Cain left for killing Abel, suddenly it appears that demons came to his kids and taught them music and farming and steel making and all kinds of stuff. And then God destroyed the world with the flood. So it does seem that there was heavy demonic activity. And so maybe this is why people believed in black magic. Well, in these verses, it seems like Job may have been dabbling or hinting at black magic. And I hate to say that, because you hate to say that a godly man would do this. But I don't see any way around it. Let me try to show it to you here. You see, in ancient times, there are many books with curses in them. And it was believed that to make a magical curse, you had to take the original blessing of order and say the opposite. So if God says, let there be light, the curse would say, let there be darkness. That's a way of countering good with chaos. And here's the verses, in verses 3 through 13. I will first tell you what Job said, and then I will compare it to Genesis chapter 1. And you'll see that Job curses 6 out of the 7 days of the creation. First of all, in verse 4, Job said, let it be darkness. This is the opposite of what God said, let there be light, in verse 3 of Genesis 1. Now, the second one's a little harder to get because the word is translated differently. But in verse 4b, it says, let not God above attend to it. In Genesis 1, verse 7, it says, God divided the waters below and the waters above. You see, when God divided, it's the same word, let not God attend to it. It basically means God shaped or formed the world and the waters. And Job is saying, let not God bring shape to the world, which would be day 2. Now, day 3 gets skipped. We'll talk about that in a minute. But day 4, in verse 6 of Job 3, let that night, let it not be counted in the days of the year, or in the calendar. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, God said, let there be light to divide between days and nights, and let them be signs for months and years and seasons. God created the stars and the skies, the moon and the sun, to make days, months, and weeks. And Job said, let not God have days, weeks, and years. The next one is day 5. In Job 3:8, Job mentions, get those or call those who are prepared to stir up Leviathan. And in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, God created the great sea monsters. Leviathan was a sea monster. We'll talk about him in a minute. Day 6, Job said in verse 11, why did I not die from the womb? And in Genesis 1:26, God says, let us make man. Job doesn't want to be made. He wants to be unmade. And finally, day 7. Job is in this chapter twice. He says, I want to have rest. In verse 13, he says, now I could be lying down and quiet. I could be asleep and at rest. And in Genesis 2, 2 through 3, it says, God rested on the 7th day from all his work. He sanctified it because in it he rested. So what that means is that in the first 13 verses, Job curses 6 out of the 7 days that God made. The biggest puzzle is, why did he leave out day 3? But Hartley has a fairly good explanation for that, and you can decide if you agree with it, but it does make sense. Day 3 gets skipped. That's the day where God made trees and plants, and Job didn't curse it. Hartley suggests that it is because of this. The number 7 always means order and perfection in the Bible. The number 7 is sort of a holy number. The number 6 is the curse number. Remember, 666 in Revelation means man, 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 curse, curse, curse. So curses always had 6 parts, never 7. And so his opinion is this is why Job left out one day. He couldn't leave out day 7 because rest is his main topic. He wishes he was at rest, so he has to have day 7. So he just picks ones at random and throws out 3. That's the best he can guess. Now, in case you are hesitant, as I am, to ascribe magic to Job, let's go back and talk about verse 8. Look at verse 8 of Job 3. May those who curse it, who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. Now, when he says, let those curse it who curse the day, that means magicians. When the magicians come out, who do the curses, just like today in Haiti and voodoo, people specialize in making curses. You make voodoo dolls and you make incantations. They had specialists like that back then too. You remember Balaam was the first one we hear about. So Job says, let those magicians who curse arouse the Leviathan. Whenever I hear this phrase, I always think of that old silly rated B movie. Let loose the Kraken! Remember that? I don't even remember the name of the movie. But let loose the sea monster! And the Kraken comes out of the ocean monster like Godzilla. Job is saying, let the magicians come out to arouse Leviathan. Now, Leviathan, we've talked about him just a little bit. In the Old Testament, Leviathan is mentioned several times. Most of the time, he is a sea monster. He is the symbol of chaos and disorder who lives in the sea. He's a dragon of chaos. And in fact, sometimes Leviathan is called Satan. So since Leviathan is sometimes called Satan, you might say or imply that Job is asking for help to curse his own birthday by hiring magicians to come and awaken Satan. Now that's not good. If Hartley is right, and if Job is bringing curses against the creation, and even hinting that we should bring Satan up, this is really bad. It's almost like tarot cards or black magic that he's calling on. Ironically, though, the Satan is already awake. And unknown to Job, he's already torturing Job. What's even more ironic, though, is that God told the devil, the Leviathan, you can't kill him. And Job's saying, I wish someone would raise up the Leviathan to kill me. Okay, there's a lot of irony. And he doesn't know it. But I want you to recognize that this speech is probably exactly why his friends turn on him at this point. They already suspect that he's a sinner, but they don't know. And now he's calling curses on the creation and saying, let's raise Satan up to cause destruction. That's the sort of thing that's going to get the elders coming to your house. If you pull that kind of thing at church. And as I said, I haven't had a lot of time to think about this because it's so new to me. But it does appear to me that Job is cursing the creation. He is cursing the day of his own birth. And I don't know whether he meant to say, I will use black magic, I will now condemn the creation. Or is he being sarcastic? I'm so upset, I could just curse the creation. You know, sort of like when you say, I'm going to kill you. You don't really mean you're going to kill him. You're just exaggerating. But on the other hand, thinking this clearly, coming up with a 6-point curse that just happens to be exactly like God's creation, I don't see that as being instant off the top of my head grieving. It seems to me like he's been thinking about this for a while. So anyway, at the very least, you have to say that this has to be why the friends turned on Job. Because even if he didn't mean it this way, they took it this way. You're calling on demonic powers to oppose us on the earth. That's not right. And so they're going to go on the attack. Okay, so that is the first 13 verses of Job. Now we'll look at the last 13 verses. This is the lament in verses 14 through 26. With kings and counselors of the earth who built ruins for themselves. This is one of those words we don't understand, ruins. What does it mean? Does it mean castles or who knows? Or with princes who had gold, or filled their houses with silver. Why was I not hidden like a stillborn baby, like an infant who never saw the light? There the wicked cease from troubling. There the weary are at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They do not hear the voice of the oppressor. The small and great are there. The servant is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death, but it does not come? They search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they finally find their grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes when I eat, and my groanings pour out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. Okay, so that's the last half of this chapter. Now this is just Job complaining, and I don't see any pattern here. But there are a few interesting points to make. First of all, Job wishes he was dead. And he says that he wishes he was in a place of rest. He calls it Sheol. Now, we don't have time to talk all about Sheol today, but Sheol appears to be an early understanding of the idea of hell. But you see, in many ways, we don't believe that hell exists yet. In other words, when we die, our souls go to be with Christ in heaven. And then when the judgment day comes, we're judged and we get our bodies back and we live forever. He brings Jerusalem down, we live on the earth forever. For the unbelievers who die, we believe that their souls go to Sheol, not to hell, because they haven't been judged yet. It's not until the judgment day that they go to the hell we talk about, the eternal fire. At least that's my understanding. There's a lot of different views on the intermediate state. But in the early Old Testament, they didn't really understand hell. That word wasn't used yet. They called it Sheol. And they just saw it as a temporary place after you die where you await judgment. Although usually the view was that the unbelievers and unrighteous went to Sheol, and the believers went to be with God somewhere. I think the reason that Job says he wishes he was in Sheol is because he's doubting, perhaps, that he even will go to heaven. If God is being this bad to him, maybe he's not really a believer after all. And maybe he will end up in Sheol. But what's most likely is that he's saying something like this. My life is so bad right now, it would be better for me in Sheol. However bad Sheol is, it can't be as bad as what I'm in now, so I wish I was there. Now, Job's wrong about that. It would be worse to be in Sheol. But at the moment, all he wants is rest. Apparently, he can't sleep. And I don't know if you've ever met someone who can't sleep, or if you've ever been without sleep for a couple of days. I think I've been without sleep once for 2 days, and I was messed up. I couldn't think clearly. It affects your body as well as your brain. And so Job, being unable to sleep, must be in terrible shape and not thinking clearly. But also, another interesting thing he says is about how his sighing comes before he eats and his groanings pour out like water. This seems to imply that Job might have had boils or leprosy even on his tongue or his lips. And so anytime he tried to open his mouth to eat, it caused incredible pain. That word groaning doesn't just mean like, it means screaming. It was so painful for him to open his mouth or to chew that he would just scream rather than eat. He couldn't eat. So anyway, he's in bad shape here. Notice also, another interesting point is that there was slavery at this time. God destroyed the earth and saved the righteous people, Noah and his children, but wickedness has already returned. We know that, of course, because the Tower of Babel sprung up shortly after the flood, but slavery also came up. And notice that Job doesn't like the idea of slavery. He says that it's great to be free from your master. Murder and slavery and rape, they're all back, even though Noah was just a couple hundred years before. But here's another irony in these verses. Notice he says about a hedge. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? This is an irony because Job complains that God has him hedged in darkness, when we know Satan said to God, he's hedged in protection. You're protecting him with angels, everything he owns. And God got convinced by Satan to remove the hedge. So it's just strange and sad that Job never knew about the hedge of protection. But now he knows about the hedge of troubles on him. So he can't see the good, he only sees the evil hedge. The last thing, though, that we'll spend the most time on here is verse 25. And this is where a lot of commentators disagree and they linger on this. This verse, for the thing that I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. Now, there are a lot of commentators on Job, and even people I know in person. They claim that Job was actually quite insecure of a sinner, and that this verse proves it. In other words, even though the early chapters said he was blameless and upright, in general he was blameless and upright, but actually he was really insecure. And the reason he did all the sacrificing for his kids is he knew they must be sinning. And so he was relying on his works and not grace to get salvation for himself and his kids. Now, I think that's bogus, because God said he's blameless and upright. Satan admits that he's blameless and upright. If he was such an insecure works legalist, the devil would have jumped on that and God wouldn't have called him righteous. So I cannot accept that argument. But they use this verse to try to prove that. So what that means is, I believe we're misunderstanding this verse in its origin. All right, so let's talk about this. Here's the way I agree with Barnes and some other scholars in interpreting the verse. He's not talking about his whole life. My whole life I've been afraid that this is going to come upon me. No, he's talking about that day the messengers arrived on the first day. In other words, here's what Job was saying. When the first messenger came in and told me the disaster, I was amazed. When the second messenger came in, I thought, this can't be a coincidence. When the third messenger told me what happened, I knew that something even worse must be coming because they're coming one after another. And then the fourth messenger came and my kids were dead. In other words, he's talking about that day, not his whole life. So in other words, the thing he greatly feared is sort of like this. I'm thinking that you guys have experienced this too, because I have. And I'll just give you a crass example, the Super Bowl. There was a Super Bowl a few years ago with the Falcons and the Patriots. The Falcons were whomping on the Patriots. I believe they were ahead by 24 points at the half. Well, the Falcons decided that they had already won the game. And so when they came out in the second half, they went to totally prevent defenses, and they never blitzed, which is what gave them the success. Tom Brady looked like a deer in the headlights in the first half of that game. Ah! In the second half, he was cutting them to pieces like a Thanksgiving turkey. And once he started scoring, you started to see the momentum change, and you knew the Patriots were going to win. It was almost inevitable because the momentum had changed. I think that's what Job is saying here. My whole life was going great, and then things started going wrong one after another, and the momentum had changed, and I knew that more bad was coming to me. So that's how I would interpret this verse, not saying that Job was a lifelong insecure legalist. So this is a quick pass through Job's first speech. And notice also something interesting about laments. In general, in ancient books, and even now, if you write a lament, you write it to someone, or you speak it to someone. In other words, many laments are to God. In the book of Psalms, David says, "Oh Lord, why have you left me? Why have you abandoned me? Come back to me." David talks to God with his laments. Who's Job talking to here?
His friends.
Probably his friends. He's not talking to God. He never says, "You, oh God, why are you doing this to me?" He never speaks to God. He leaves him out. It seems that he's talking to his friends. And he's not even asking them for any advice. He's just yelling out his curses and laments so that they can see how bad it is for him. So he's not lamenting to the right person. If you're going to lament, at least lament to someone who can help you. His friends have already decided they can't help him. But he's not going to God, which I believe is a sign of his anger at God. He's not willing to go to God. So his friends now, this is their excuse to start attacking him. He was never the good man that we thought he was. Not only is God crushing him, now he's talking about cursing the whole world. We have to turn him around. And so that's what his friends are going to spend the next 33 chapters doing. Trying to fix Job because of his rash words. Even if I'm wrong about the curse, even if Job isn't cursing the creation, he is cursing the sovereignty of God. The reason that God lets us live is because he's got plans for us. And so to say, "God, you need to kill me," isn't the right thing to say. Elijah said it. So if you remember when Elijah had done his great miracle on the mountain and fire came down from heaven, he was so excited. And then Jezebel said she was going to kill him. And he spent days running. And then he just collapsed under a bush and said, "God, just kill me. I'm not worth living." What did God do? Did God kill him? No. God sent him an angel to feed him and protect him while he was resting. So Job is wrong. He's already speaking badly. I would guess that it is sinful what he's saying, cursing God, and the fact that he's not saying it to God is the worst part. If you're mad at God, if you're upset at God, tell him you're upset at God. At least keep talking to him. Because it doesn't do any good to just yell your curses at the world and let the whole world see that you're failing in your faith. So I'm guessing that Satan is sitting back at this point and saying, "Oh, I've almost got him." All he's got to do is say, "I curse God," and I win the bet, so to speak. Job never comes out and says it exactly, so he doesn't win. But he's got to be right on the edge. He's on the knife edge of falling over into darkness. So that's all of chapter 3. It's kind of a depressing chapter, but I hope you learned some interesting things from it. Mike, would you close us in prayer?
God, how grateful we are for your word, for the time that John's given to study, Lord. We pray that as he was taught this morning, we might spend time researching, Lord, studying, Lord, that we too find the things to be taught to be true. Pray, Lord, that today we would indeed glorify you. Pray that our hearts and minds would be prepared for the worship that we offer. I pray all these things in Jesus' precious and holy name. Amen.
I did finish early, so I should have asked if there were any questions or comments that you find about Job chapter 3. Yes?
On a personal note, when our daughter was dying, I remember at one point I went out to the car and I said, "Lord, if you're going to take her. If you're going to heal her, heal her." Well, I was in a Pentecostal church at the time. So you know, and then when she died, you know, there was a lot, when we have a loved one die, there's a lot of guilt associated with that death as Christians. Because you question, you know, it's like, what did I not do? What did we not do enough? Did we not pray enough? Did we not fast enough? It's like, what did we not do enough? But it wasn't until we came into the Reformed belief, that's the right word, system, is when it's out of our, that's when it dawned on me personally, that it was nothing that I did or did not do. It was in God's plan that Heather not live past the age of 6.5 or any, you know, so.
Yes,
I got more peace from that, knowing that it had nothing to do with what I did or did not do, that it was God's plan from the beginning. But also when you're going through a heavy, whether you call it a trial or tribulation, you don't always know what to say, you don't always know what to pray as a Christian. And one of the first things that someone told me after Heather died was, you cannot get mad at God. And in hindsight, you know, that was one of the worst things you tell a Christian, because you don't always understand. It's like, you know, why did Mike and I have to go through that? Why does anyone have to go through something like that?
well, and the question of holding, you got a bunch of points there. Holding in your anger, when people tell you you shouldn't be angry at God, they're right in a sense, but they're wrong in the worst sense.
Yes.
Because it's better to be honest with God than it is to be holding it in. In fact, they say that when you hold in your anger, it eventually becomes bitterness. And so then you become bitter against God rather than angry against God. It's better to just let the stress out. I'm not suggesting Gestalt therapy where you just yell at the heavens.
No.
But being honest before God is more important than not being angry at God. Just because you're wrong doesn't mean you're not it. It's better to be wrong with God than right and away from God. The other point is about the Reformed faith having the sovereignty of God. It is easy. I mean, I haven't had a lot of loved ones die yet. But it is, I'm hearing from people, it's easy to be guilty about some deaths. Why did I live and why did my child die, or something like that? Well, the sovereignty of God is an answer. It's unlikely that you did anything personally to cause the death of the child. It's just that God was finished with that child and ready to have that person in heaven. So having the sovereignty of God in the Reformed faith is a great blessing, rather than the opposite view, which is that everything's sort of by chance and that he just got unlucky or she got unlucky. So yes, that's a good point. Yes?
I'm thinking when Job, all this stuff's coming on Job, it's like when you go out and have a bad week, you go, why did I even leave the house today? You know, why did Job even, you know, leave his house and have all this stuff come upon him?
He didn't even leave the house, the messengers came
in.
Yeah. So Job is an amazing example of patience, but I think we've exaggerated his patience. He was patient at first, he was not patient through the whole thing. And that's actually, to me, a better example than if he had totally been patient, because it's kind of hard to relate to somebody who is just superhuman. He is showing that he is human. He didn't quite step over the line, but he's trying. So it'll happen to us too. Hopefully not in this whole horrible fashion. Okay, well, we've got time to pray before the worship service starts, so we'll end it there. Oh, wrong one. New batteries in. I don't know if you saw, but I got a new battery charge. They were both just about half, so I chose them.
So it's all this and round. Except for